Good morning and welcome to another thought for the day. This morning I'm going to read quite a long passage from the book of Acts, chapter 7, verses 17 to 43. It's a long part of Stephen's speech to the Sanhedrin. He's been accused of blasphemy against Moses and God, and so this speech is his response to the high priest who has asked him, are these charges true? And sadly we know that this speech led to his stoning and death. So I'm going to start reading the speech. As the time drew near for God to fulfill his promise to Abraham, the number of our people in Egypt had greatly increased. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. He dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our ancestors by forcing them to throw out their newborn babies so that they would die. At that time Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months he was cared for by his family. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. When Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. The next day, Moses came upon 2 Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, "Men, you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other?" But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. When he saw this, he was amazed at the sight. As he went over to take a closer look, he heard the Lord say, "I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Moses trembled with fear and did not dare to look. Then the Lord said to him, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. I have indeed seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their groaning, and I have come down to set them free. Now come, I will send you back to Egypt." This is the same Moses they had rejected with words, "Who made you ruler and judge?" He was sent to be their ruler and deliverer by God himself through the angel who appeared to him in the bush. He led them out of Egypt and performed wonders and signs in Egypt, at the Red Sea, and for 40 years in the wilderness. This is the Moses who told the Israelites, "God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your own people." He was in the assembly in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai and with our ancestors, and he received living words to pass on to us. But our ancestors refused to obey him. Instead, they rejected him and in their hearts turned back to Egypt. They told Aaron, "Make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who led us out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." That was the time they made an idol in the form of a calf. They brought sacrifices to it and reveled in what their own hands had made. But God turned away from them and gave them over to the worship of the sun, moon, and stars. And this agrees with what is written in the book of the prophets. Did you bring me sacrifices and offerings 40 years in the wilderness, people of Israel? You have taken up the tabernacle of Molech and the star of your god Rephan, the idols you made to worship. Therefore, I will send you into exile beyond Babylon. So there's a lot said in that speech. But we need to remember that in the Jewish mind, those who are accusing him, there could be no prophet better than Moses. Moses, of course, delivered their people from Egyptian bondage, and Moses also gave the law of God to the Jews. And Stephen is, of course, a follower of Jesus, and so the Jews are insisting that Stephen is rejecting Moses and God's law. But through his speech, Stephen is reminding the Jews that actually it was their own people who had rejected Moses on so many occasions. And he also reminds them that Moses himself had said that another prophet greater than him would come. So in a really clever way, Jesus is actually accusing the Jews of rejecting Moses themselves, both historically and at this present time, by ignoring Moses' prophecies of and about Jesus. It's a very clever speech, but sadly one which cost his life. I just want to point out a couple of words that struck me through reading this passage, and those are the words of patience and humility. Don't we always need to be so patient when we are working with God in his times? Moses had been extremely well educated, brought up as an Egyptian up until the age of 40, and there's good evidence that he was actually being trained to be the next Pharaoh of Egypt. He would have been trained, very well trained in leadership, but this wasn't adequate training for leading God's people. And so God needed another 40 years to work on Moses before Moses would be ready to lead God's people out of slavery in Egypt. And this training, God's training, happened whilst Moses was working as a lowly shepherd. I wonder if through his Egyptian training he had become very proud, perhaps arrogant, and relying on his own self-assurance. Perhaps God needed to switch this self-assurance to a complete dependency on God. Perhaps he needed also to teach him humility. Perhaps shepherding was, maybe still is, a wonderful way of teaching humility in preparation for God's leadership. And we'll know that shepherding is one of those fabulous themes that runs right through the Bible and was part of preparing many of God's great leaders. And so I find it very interesting that shepherding is clearly absent from today's ordination training. So today the two words that I just want us to take away from this morning's passage, the two words are patience and humility. God bless.